These cases do not want to sit up. Yeah, she can. I can send it to her.
There we go. Yeah, look at this. Just pulled it up. Better to have hard copy. Yes.
It's a work session, but
It's a session at which we expect all new members to give
that's
information.
exactly right. You're good. It's coming, that's right, that's right.
The fire hydrant's been open.
I think she's really just waiting for it to close a little bit.
I was very quiet my first few meetings. No, no, but it was a lot.
Welcome to the Committee on Standards of Quality meeting from the State Board of Education. We have a fair amount of ground to cover, so we're not going to make many preliminary remarks other than to, again, thank staff for continuing to work with the board as this process, moves forward. There's been a lot of evolution, and I feel like we're finally coming down to a place that we're all going to agree, by October. In any event, first item of business is public comment. Is there nobody signed up apparently, but are there people who would like to speak to the committee?
Good afternoon, President Gecker, Vice President Atkinson, Dr. Lane, members of the board. I'm Kathy Bircher with the Virginia Education Association. I'm speaking today because our president will be here tomorrow speaking on a different topic. So I wanted to make sure you were able to get the VEA's thoughts and opinions on the proposals on the standards of quality and the revisions you're looking at today. VEA continues to be incredibly grateful to this board for your assertive and aggressive work to ensure that every student in the Commonwealth has the resources that they need to be successful in our K-12 system. Just a couple of components that I wanted to make sure we pointed out. The VEA, and you'll have the language in front of you, encourages you to once again consider the language we put before you before the last staff revision to ensure that there's an additional teacher support in one of those positions for every qualifying school as defined in that section of the proposal. Under specialized student support, VEA continues to request that nurses be registered nurses, RNs, and we ask for the inclusion of that language. And finally, under the equity fund, the VEA continues to be concerned by the section that says the board shall assign licensed personnel in a manner that. I appreciate the second sentence that begins to the maximum extent possible, but we're concerned with the assumption that length of service equates to effective teaching in any situation without the types of supports that would be necessary. So we urge you to reconsider that. We certainly understand the intent, and we believe that having the appropriate supports for those teachers will help them be successful. As to the new additions to the equity fund and the establishment of the equity fund, we are incredibly grateful for the movement of both the at-risk add-on and the other components to the standards of quality. We think that that's where it belongs, again, to assure that every student across the Commonwealth can be successful. We're certainly concerned, and we appreciate the flexibility, but are concerned with some of those components that there is some over flexibility that may allow for differentiation of services across school divisions that may in fact undo some of the equity I think this board is trying to seek. But again, we are overall incredibly grateful to your work and look forward to working with you and members of the General Assembly and the governor to move as much of this forward as possible.
Great, thank you very much. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak to the board? Well, excuse me, the committee, I guess, today.
Good afternoon. I'm Trolin Seward, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Virginia State Reading Association and the Virginia Academy of School Psychologists. Both asked me to express their appreciation to you for including them in the standards of quality proposals. You already understand the needs surrounding these positions, so I will certainly not take time speaking to that. I will say, however, that because many divisions are already paying for these positions with local and or federal funds, the mandate issue should not be as much of an obstacle when it gets to the legislature. That is assuming, of course, that we get it there. Your process in preparing this proposal or these proposals has been very deliberate and bold, and your product is one that when it is fully implemented will make the children and young people of this Commonwealth beneficiaries of the services needed for every child to reach the goals enabling him or her to be a fully participating member of his or her community. Again, thank you for your perseverance and your leadership.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? I don't see anybody, but I can't see around that corner. Often people like to duck back there to avoid this. So. Nobody coming? All right. Yeah, well, we'll close then public comment, and Zach and Emily, it's yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, President Gecker, Dr. Lane, members of the board. We're working on getting the PowerPoint show running. So I just want to start out by briefly reminding the committee where we were at the July meeting. We had wrong presentation. I think where we were, we had general consensus on the proposals for teacher, leader, and mentor programs, English learner teachers, specialized support personnel, work-based learning coordinators, principal mentorship, as well as reaffirming several of the board's prior recommendations from 2016. There they all are. With respect to reading specialists, there was some discussion about the metric used to distribute reading specialist positions. You'll recall we recommended that the reading specialist positions be provided in grades K through 5 based upon the SOL, third grade SOL reading test failure rates. And there was some concern that the PALS assessment or diagnostic tool was a better indicator of reading deficiencies, and that's how we currently distribute funds, the incentive funds for reading specialists currently. And it was suggested that we consider a hybrid approach using PALS data for distributing positions in K through 2 and SOL assessments in grades 3 through 5. And we found that this hybrid approach actually would result in a lower number of reading specialists. Therefore, staff recommends that we continue the approach of using grade 3 reading failure rates to distribute reading specialist positions across the K through 5 grade span. With respect to targeted compensation adjustments, the proposal that we discussed last time would have provided pay adjustments to experienced teachers, those with 5 or more years of experience to teach in high poverty schools. And then we looked at an at-risk add-on proposal that would have provided additional instructional positions to school divisions based upon the concentration of poverty in the school divisions, with some flexibility built in for how those funds are used in schools with 55% or more free lunch population. We also looked at a class size reduction proposal that would have expanded the K-3 class size reduction program to include grades 4 through 6 as well, but we discovered that that would have a $213 million fiscal impact.
And one thing I will note, some of you all had some questions kind of in the interim. And so we're going to be hopefully addressing those as we go through the presentation. And then at the end, if there's anything that we didn't address, feel free to chime in and ask us some questions.
So based on the board's discussion about these proposals in July, we suggested an alternative approach that would, well, the board was interested in an alternative approach that would allow school divisions to staff high poverty schools with either smaller class sizes for inexperienced teachers or to staff high poverty schools with experienced teachers, provided that they're given a compensation adjustment to assist with recruitment and retention in those high poverty schools. So staff has revisited the compensation adjustment proposal, at-risk add-on, and the class size reduction program, and we now propose establishing SOQ funds that can be used to provide additional staff, compensation adjustments, and other at-risk and remediation programs, and we're referring to this as the equity fund. We're also recommending requiring class size reduction in grades K through 3, whereas currently it's a program that's outside of the SOQ. We're recommending bringing that into the SOQ and including some flexibility to where school divisions can use those funds for class size reduction to hire experienced teachers in lieu of reducing the class size, and if they're provided a compensation adjustment. Just to review the proposals that are in your packet, I just plan on going into detail on this equity fund proposal and the class size reduction proposal. So our proposal for the equity fund would provide additional resources to local school boards based upon the concentration of free lunch students. And the funding would be distributed based upon providing supplemental instructional positions to support students that are eligible for free lunch. So there would be an additional 10 to 65% add-on instructional positions above the SOQ positions that are currently allocated and these would be allocated based upon the free lunch population in the division. So the division with the lowest free lunch rate would receive 10% additional SOQ positions per free lunch student, while the division with the greatest free lunch rate would receive 65% additional positions per free lunch student. And while we're using these positions to allocate the funds, we've built in some flexibility for what these funds could be used for. The first option would be to provide the additional instructional staff that the formula produces. Also, the funds could be used to provide specialized student support personnel, school nurses, social workers, or psychologists. The funds could also be used for targeted compensation adjustments for teachers to teach in high poverty schools. And we've also built in a flexibility provision that would allow up to 70% of the funds for those positions to be used to support at-risk or remediation programs, similar to the uses that school divisions can use at-risk and the Prevention, Intervention, and Remediation Fund for. So staff proposes that this be accomplished by merging and expanding two existing pots of funds, the at-risk add-on incentive funds, which are currently outside of the SOQ, which provides about $121 million. These are funds that divisions currently can use for a variety of uses geared towards students that are at risk of academic failure. And they're distributed on a similar formula to the 10 to 65% range of additional positions. Those are currently distributed using a 1% to 16% add-on to your basic aid on a per free lunch student basis. Also, the Prevention, Intervention, and Remediation SOQ funds, those are currently in the SOQ. That's about $112 million that are provided to school divisions that can generally be used on any type of remediation program. And those funds are distributed based upon free lunch rates, but also take into account failure rates on SOQ tests. So school divisions that have the lowest failure rate receive a smaller amount, as opposed to the divisions with the greatest failure rate receive a larger amount. And also this would be accompanied with about $131 million in new funds for a total of about $364 million that would support students in poverty. So in talking about those two pots of money that we would use, I just wanted to share how these funds are currently distributed statewide on a per free lunch student basis. So each dot on this graph represents a school division. The blue dots represent the at-risk add-on program. I'm sorry, the red dots represent the at-risk add-on program, and the blue dots represent prevention, intervention, and remediation. The divisions on the left side of the graph have the lowest percentage of students eligible for free lunch, and on the right represents the highest percent, those divisions with the highest percent of students eligible for free lunch. And vertically, from top to bottom, that's the amount of the state funds per free lunch student in each division. So what you see is the blue dots for prevention, intervention, and remediation. Generally, all school divisions fall into about the $400 to $500 per free lunch student range. So those funds are distributed on a fairly flat basis. There's not a whole lot of correlation to the poverty rates in each school division. And for the at-risk add-on, you'll see the red dots. That formula provides additional support to the divisions that have greater concentrations of poverty. So you see the correlation where on the right side, about $1,000 going to the divisions with the greatest concentrations of poverty, and on the left side, about $100 per free lunch student.
And one thing as it relates to at-risk that one of you had asked in our kind of our off month was was about the data on, do we know that local divisions are spending those dollars on the most at-risk students? We do not have data on that specifically. I think we know anecdotally, but we don't have specific data. But in the proposal, we do have that they would have to report annually on the usage of those dollars.
So this graph shows the existing pots of money and how those are allocated. This chart shows the purple at the bottom. Those are, it's actually the combination of the prevention, intervention, and remediation funds and the at-risk add-on funds. That's kind of why I picked that color. So by eliminating the use of failure rates and solely using free lunch rates to distribute additional supports for students in poverty, we would maximize the additional funding in the divisions with the greatest poverty. So the green is showing the proposed equity fund and how those funds would be distributed. So you see, currently there's a more flat distribution of funds. Most divisions receiving about $750 to $1,200 per free lunch student in at-risk and remediation funds. Under this proposal, because it's prioritizing the divisions with the greatest rate of poverty, the divisions with as much as 80% free lunch rate, they would receive as much as $2,200 per free lunch student. A significantly greater amount than they're currently receiving, and the divisions with the lower on the lower end would receive closer to what they're receiving now, which I think is about $500 for the divisions with the lowest poverty rates.
And in some of the scenarios that we were toying around with, there were a handful of divisions under different proposals that would lose money. Under this equity fund, no one is a loser under this proposal.
So as we mentioned earlier, the provision that would allow 70% of the funds to be used flexibly. This demonstrates how we arrived at that figure. The bar on the left represents the existing at-risk and prevention, intervention, remediation funds. There's about $233 million in fairly flexible funds that the state provides. The bar on the right represents the proposed program. There's an additional $131 million in new funds. The green line, everything above the green line is new funds. And in blue, those are the funds that are allowed to be used for flexible purposes, 70%. So most of the additional funds, the $109 million that's in excess of 70%, those would be restricted to either targeted compensation adjustments or providing additional instructional positions or student support positions. As Emily mentioned, this does not reduce state funding for any school divisions. And this keeps roughly about the same amount of flexible money available for school divisions as is available today. I would note that a few school divisions would see how much money they have available for flexible uses would reduce nominally. And it's only about $3 million spread across 34 school divisions that would see a slight reduction in the amount of funds that they would have flexible access to. So I have a few more slides that walk through the formula step by step, and I can walk through that with the board if necessary. And it actually shows, that might help show some scenarios as far as how many positions would be distributed to divisions.
I have a question,
Sure. Sure.
and Emily, and if further slides will answer the question, I'm happy to wait. You mentioned that 34 school divisions, I believe, would have lesser flexibility. Can you give us some what should we know about those 34 school divisions that would help us have a sense of the impact in terms of flexibility that they might enjoy now?
Right. So they'd still be receiving additional state funds. And in positions that they currently have that are in excess of the SOQ, those funds would actually, they could be used for funding that. So, so I'm doubtful that it would, in actuality, reduce any flexibility for any division, because most of those divisions are already well-to-do divisions that are exceeding the SOQ.
They're divisions that are exceeding the SOQ currently.
Yes. All right, so I'm going to walk through briefly and show this formula step by step and how this would work. So the first step would be to rank the school divisions by their free lunch rate, to assign the add-on multiplier that's between 10% and 65%. As you see here, Petersburg has the greatest free lunch rate at 78%, so they would get a 65% add-on multiplier. And Falls Church is at the other end of the spectrum, and they would have a 10% add-on multiplier. The second step would be to determine the number of SOQ basic aid positions. This is a figure that school divisions are familiar with, as it's generated by the SOQ funding model. And then the third step would be to multiply the number of basic aid positions from step 2 by the add-on multiplier in the first step by the number of free lunch students, or by the percentage of free lunch students. And what this results in, for example, with Petersburg, currently the SOQ provides Petersburg with 212 basic aid positions, but it would provide 107 additional positions under the equity fund proposal. And with the provisions on how those funds can be used, Petersburg could use 75 of those positions, the funds for 75% of those positions for those flexible at-risk positions that or remediation purposes. And then they would still need to address the other 32 positions, either by hiring 32 additional positions, or they may already have 32 additional positions under the SOQ, or they could use those funds to provide targeted compensation adjustments to experienced teachers in the highest poverty schools in the division.
Zach, could you repeat that for me again? Because I think I might have a question, but I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. So the permitted uses, for the equity fund positions are instructional positions, specialized student support positions, targeted compensation, and then up to 70% of them could be used for at-risk or remediation programs. 70% of 107 comes to 75 positions. So they could use the funds for 75 instead of filling the positions using for those flexible purposes. Then the 30% or 32 positions, they would need to either fill or provide targeted compensation adjustments.
You said a third thing though, because you said they could fill. You said something about existing.
So, or they could
Oh, yeah.
already have those, they could already be 32 positions above the SOQ, and those positions could
They
count.
could use those dollars
Correct.
to pay those that
Those
they would
32.
currently be using local funds for.
Correct.
Correct. Yep. Now there's a provision in the proposal that would direct school boards to ensure that they are prioritizing these funds in their highest poverty schools. So divisions would need to analyze where they're in excess of the SOQ to make sure that those additional positions are being allocated to the highest poverty schools.
Mr. President? Zach, I apologize that I have a question. I know we're hundreds of hours in on this, but I think it's good for me to ask this one. So Petersburg is generally funded locally at the SOQ. They don't have a lot of funding over the SOQ.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we talking about in terms of the local requirement to match these 107 positions? Many divisions are already funding these positions, so they don't have quite the burden that, say, a Petersburg would. Not that all do.
That's why I have my laptop open.
Zach
I was,
has a
I was,
spreadsheet.
I was anticipating that I'd need access to the spreadsheet. So Petersburg, they have a 0.2 local composite index. Yeah, 0.243. For Petersburg, that would mean they would need to kick in $750,000, but they'd be receiving almost $4
They
million.
would be receiving almost 4 million additional funds, but their local match would be about $750,000.
What percentage are they funding over the SOQ right now? Is there any?
I think they're pretty close. I think
Okay.
they're just at that.
Yeah, that was my thought, but I was just curious.
If I may, just so I think Petersburg is an extreme example, but I think it helps us clarify, and it's an extreme example that we're all very focused on, that end of the spectrum. So Petersburg would get an extra $4 million of state funds, and locals would have to kick in $750,000. So they're going to get an extra $5 million compared to what they're currently. Do we know what their current total is?
What their current effort
Yes,
is right now?
state and local effort. It's
I think they are right at,
their, what is their full SOQ now, I guess would be is that a?
Zach, check your phone.
somebody in the bullpen is texting me. Oh, actually, Petersburg, I have a text that says Petersburg is 25% above the required
Oh,
local
okay.
effort.
Okay.
But I think that might be older data, because I think this current school year is.
Ed,
Saying your phone
okay.
is wrong, are you?
18,
Well, okay, but meanwhile, I've come up with a ballpark answer to my own question.
it's 18. 18 million?
Is the
Percent over required.
Oh,
local
18.
effort.
What's the total Petersburg budget?
it's ballpark 40 million.
Do you have their state match?
Their ballpark is somewhere around 40 million. That could be plus or minus 5 million.
That was my
But,
assumption.
so they're going to be getting an extra 10% or more increase out of this. So say, you did some useful examples both here and in your document. One of the ones I liked in the document you gave us was translating in these various scenarios what this would mean in terms of how many extra equity positions or how much extra flexible funds. And you said, or provide targeted compensation adjustments. If Petersburg, for instance, wanted to take all of their extra money and put it towards compensation, they could give their teaching staff an across-the-board compensation kick of somewhere in the 10% range or more if they did just teachers, if they targeted it to teachers.
If they were a qualified teacher, if they
Yeah,
would they'd have to be an experienced teacher.
Okay, gotcha.
Right, but it's a
Okay,
way to
but on
provide more money to
average,
equalize the playing.
on average, they could use this to fund some fairly significant compensation
Correct.
Correct.
adjustments,
Correct.
is what I'm trying to understand.
For a teacher with 5 years.
I mean,
or
it could
more
be, it could be
experience.
more than, it could be 20% or
It could
more.
be up to-
If,
yeah,
if once
25%.
recognizing you're focused on your experienced teachers and also recognizing, so I'm taking, you're going to get a 4 million, you're going to get a 10% bump in your overall budget. Your light bill isn't going to get more expensive. You might not be bumping all staff's increase. You might not be bumping up your admin people or your support people. You might be bumping up just your experienced teachers. So this might be a way to fund a 25% kind of increase for your experienced faculty.
Correct.
Might be well within the range. Thank you.
Yeah, Diane.
All right, so I'm back to the question I asked you a few minutes ago. So theoretically, would it be possible for a division to receive these funds and really get no new bodies in the system? Because they backfill what they're doing locally.
Theoretically,
Theoretically,
yes.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
I
Okay.
mean, if a division is putting in significantly above,
Mhm.
required, theoretically, yes.
What I would say is, I mean, they'll get more money either way, so theoretically, they can backfill what they have, but, so that it may be all flexible money, but that doesn't mean that it won't be invested where you intend.
Where we hope,
Yeah.
we intend probably.
Right.
But, so more funding tends to go towards the students that need it most or teachers. That, we can't guarantee that because they will have the flexibility if they do use it to backfill.
Right. Now, I would say if we play with that 70% and back that down, then that would be driving additional positions.
And I think we also have to remember some of the other potential ratios you may be changing. That could certainly shift where they are in the SOQ as well with what they're funding.
Could I make a suggestion?
Sure.
In the next iteration of the document, because I'm sure there's still some revisions that may happen, it would be helpful I find it helpful to say where there are, for example, on page 3, the sub-bullet or sub-bullets first set, school divisions would be able to use the funds subject to these conditions, bottom of page 3, colon, and then you've got 2 to separate those perhaps with and or, and in the scenarios that you have, which are also very useful, I agree with Ms. Holton, these are, the school division could do any or all of these. So indicating combinations where there are combinations so that as folks read the document, they understand what is permissible and what's not versus.
It's not pick one on. It's not just pick one option.
Or one or the two, and
Right.
then not the third. So just being very clear about that to the reader would be helpful, I think.
All right. So next area we're going to talk about is K-3 class size reduction. Currently, class size reduction is oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Well, just first I wanted to say, so I was not here last time. I don't know how much of this you all discussed last time, but where you all have gotten on this equity fund is quite remarkable and really hard work. And I'm very excited about it and applaud the hard effort. I have one nitpicky language thing on the bottom of page 4. And I've raised this before and you didn't change it, so maybe you have a reason. But the last sentence in section C shall not don't want assigned personnel in a manner that results in the concentration of effective or ineffective teachers. Well, we don't want well, no, I'm okay with effective, but we don't want to concentrate ineffective teachers in any school group. But I don't mind them concentrating effective teachers. And also, I don't like binding them on both sides. You can mean, we're dagged-on if we do and daggone if we don't. So I would delete the
Effective or.
correct,
Can I
unless
follow-
there's some reason that I'm
Diane.
missing.
I would like to follow that up because how are we going to define effective? I think as we talk about what we looked at as far as targeted compensation, we were looking at experience. And so we've now introduced another piece of terminology without any parameters around what that might mean. And so I just think maybe we should think or look at that.
We were thinking about using our as a definition. So even if that changes later to something more evaluation aligned, that's the intent there. Agree with the elimination of effective or, but the intent is to use that definition. So this is talking about the concentration of provisionally licensed and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Inexperienced and provisionally licensed.
Anything else on equity funds?
Just a really quick question, wondering about, has there been any discussion on the kind of information that's going to be sought about use of funds? just given some of the questions that have surfaced here already, just curious, without being overly prescriptive, onerous, et cetera, but the kinds of things that we want to really be able to appreciate around how these resources are being used. Has there been discussion about that?
Not quite at the granular level. Through this analysis on all of the SOQ proposals, what we've found is that it's difficult to get an accurate picture of how SOQ, of what positions school divisions are deploying over and above what's required by the SOQ, what they're funding on their own. There's some positions we can easily figure out. We know how many assistant principals we have in the state versus how many we actually fund. But then when we get into some of the more specific areas like English learner teachers or fourth grade teachers, we have a difficult, the data that we collect doesn't accurately show how positions are being deployed across the state
Yeah.
to inform our SOQ deliberations.
Yeah, as we've been digging into the details, we see certain areas that are very limited. So once we are done, I think with these revisions to the SOQ, as staff, we're going to have a larger conversation about some of the data we need kind of moving forward so that we're better able to support you all into the future.
And just for background, that at-risk add-on program, currently the only requirement for school divisions to report to us is what categories did they budget funds in, and they don't even report the amount. They just tell us what categories. So there's very limited information specifically in that area that we currently receive.
Kim?
I know when we were convening the equity committee, getting to this incredible milestone, which I want to thank everyone for getting to this point. It's pretty exciting. One of the things this is probably, we probably didn't even think about, but we had discussed it just briefly, what terminology and what it means to people or even our elected officials. So equity sometimes can resonate in a different way. It means something. And I don't know if that's positive. I guess it depends on what lens you're looking for. I mean, we defined it very clearly. It's giving all children what they need to be successful versus comparing it to equality, treating everyone the same. And this is part of the rationale moving forward. The reason why I'm bringing that up in a long, way too drawn out manner is equity fund the right name? Will it stop in its tracks because of some connotations that may go with that? Maybe it's like, on up fund or fast moving on. I don't know what it is, but, I didn't know if you had that discussion or, because when you really read it, you understand, and I think it can resonate with a lot of people, but I didn't know if that was part of any of your discussions.
Yeah, I think one reason folks are so kind of ingrained with the term at-risk add-on that when we were moving it into the SOQ and making some changes to it, we didn't want folks to get confused. So I think we're certainly open to other terms, not wedded to it, but we felt good to call it something a little different than what we currently have.
I agree. I like it, but I didn't know how it resonated with other individuals.
Diane?
So as I look at this, and I have to be honest, I'm stuck on the fact that there is a theoretical chance that we are asking for a lot more money, and it is possible some divisions will not have new positions as a result. I thought when we went into this, we had a specific goal, and that was to ensure, or try to ensure, that our students who are most at risk have the additional services, access to more experienced teachers. And I am concerned that as it is currently structured, I'm not sure that we're going to say we're getting there. And I worry, I'm not sure how I could, if I had a conversation using some of these scenarios, if someone got to the same, that comment that you made, they could use it for existing positions that they are funding over the SOQ. stops me in my tracks because where I can't then guarantee to somebody that we've changed what is happening or potentially change what's happening in a school. And so I just want to highlight that. I think I don't know how, I can't give you a suggestion as to how to change it, but that has just really jumped out at me, and I just want us to think about that a little bit.
Would you be interested in exploring if we toyed with the 70% and say we dropped it to 50%? And because I think once you play with that, then divisions will be required to fill some positions. But in the inverse, that there would be some flexible money that they currently have access to that they would no longer have access to.
What we were after at the beginning of this was to, as I said, have a more equitable distribution of teachers, if that is the easiest way to say it. I know we have difficulty measuring teacher effectiveness and all the other problems that go with it. Our ability to mandate that at the granular level is pretty small. Mm-hmm. And so what we are doing here almost as a proxy for that is we're saying that either you can, have smaller class size and younger teachers, or you can have, or we'll give you the funding essentially to have enough money to attract more qualified, or in this case, more experienced, until we have a better way to measure it, teachers. The fact that we can't guarantee that this will be effective in every jurisdiction, although it is a way to say no to it, is not to me that compelling. I do believe that if you go to the jurisdictions that need this the most, the additional funds are essential to provide the quality of education that we expect in the Commonwealth. And as an old buddy of mine used to always say to me, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In every system that we put together, there are going to be some drawbacks. If you look even, we talked some at lunch about SOLs. I mean, back in whatever it was 20-something years ago now, when SOLs came in, there were, a certain number of positives. I mean, and in fact, if you look at the data, there were a significant number of positives that came out of SOLs, the, increases in certain scores of certain groups, et cetera. There were also a certain number of negatives, right? My view of which unfortunately in the 20 years from when the SOLs were introduced, nobody bothered to address. My hope is that if we institute a system that is the beginning of a redistribution that has the equitable outcome as the goal, that instead of it being, we're going to look at this once every 20 years, but we actually review, how is it working? Are there changes we can make? The original contemplation of the SOQs was they'd be issued annually. Right. If you go back again historically, in the 71 with the Constitution, they issued in 71, they issued in 72, they issued in 73, they issued in 74. And the document changed over time. Right. Back in the 70s, as you've heard us talk about, the target graduation rate in the Commonwealth was 70%. Certainly would not be an acceptable figure today for us to put the target graduation rate in the, this SOQ, as 70%. And so, again, from my perspective, and I'm not suggesting we don't tinker around the edges here, but the basic thrust of where we want to go, and I also think in terms of the reality of this, if any of us believe that this is going to be implemented in the next fiscal year in the Commonwealth, I think that's just not likely to happen. What we are trying to do, what I'm trying to do, and I think what the board has been trying to do, is to set out that marker and say, A, we need additional funding. This accomplishes that. B, if you really want to improve the outcome for our students, it's in the teachers. We have talked about and done the research on, does the social service overlay work? Well, the answer is yeah, some, but not really a lot, right? Does reduction in class size work? The answer is yeah, some, but not really a lot. If you want bang for the buck, if you really want to put, to strive to achieve, outcomes where we can reduce and perhaps eliminate the achievement gap materially, the answer is going to be with the teachers. And we know that, at least we hope that in 18 months, James will have his project done with, how can we begin to measure effectiveness of teachers. And when that comes in, assuming it's on time, which nothing ever is, so let's assume it's 24 to 36 months out. Point is that when we have more ability to distribute the teaching profession more equitably, and I understand all the limitations on who supervises schools and all that, but put that to the side for a minute. Assume we had everybody on board with the idea that the outcome was worth giving up a little bit of control. Assume that's just for the minute. When we have that ability, then we can address that more directly. Right now, what we have the ability to do is, and if you look at where Virginia stands in terms of education funding, we're low enough down that suggesting we bring ourselves to the mid-range or maybe the upper, quartile is not really a radical concept. And that we have those funds right now because, again, of the way we're set up with the incentives to, hire more experienced teachers who might have more ability to classroom manage, for example, in the earlier years. I view that as a very positive thing. And I understand your, concern, and I understand how some will say we can't do this because we have this possibility that in 5 jurisdictions, we're going to have nothing really change. But if we can change those jurisdictions that are on the lower end of the outcome spectrum right now, and we know who they are, we don't need to keep naming them, we'll have done an incredibly good thing for the state and for those children. So that's my pitch on this. Ms. Atkins.
Just wanted to, if your takeaway is maybe going to look at that percentage change, I just wanted to share that I would support keeping it around 70%, because also part of that conversation, in addition to everything that our president just shared, was in the middle of that teacher shortage, rewarding the profession at the level that it should be. And it comes down to that local level, how that they want to do that. If it's making them more competitive and attracting what's coming out of school or from another state or area, then that should be their prerogative versus, really trying to fill, additional positions that probably definitely need to be filled. So I wanted to support Dan's position on that, keeping that flexibility, but the 70% really resonates with me. So if unless there's others that would like to see or entertain a reduction in that percentage, I would like to hear it, because I don't know, that's the directive that I would want to see them go in, but of course, majority rules. So I would want to hear if that's still on the table for additional discussion.
Yeah, Ms. Holton.
So if I may weigh in, I do think that the highest poverty divisions typically have the lowest current dollars above the SOQs, but sort of almost by definition. And so that Petersburg figure, I'm kind of with you, Zach. I wonder if that 25%, even at 25% over SOQs, I'd be surprised at that, it being it may even be budgeted but not actually funded or something. There was a time when they were right at the SOQs. That may be wrong. They may have moved beyond that by now, but I think you would find many of the divisions that we're most worried about would in fact have to be ponying up new local dollars and having the opportunity to spend these new state dollars. And in light of that, I would worry about, I would go for maximum flexibility, meaning I like your 70%.
I would say the 17-18 data is online for Petersburg, and it actually does show a fairly significant amount of excess over local requirements.
I'm just remembering there was a time when they
18,
were
19 days,
budgeting, when I was more involved, they were budgeting more, but not actually paying it. There was a.
Yeah.
So just our assumptions that we used earlier were true. 37.7 million state, local, required local effort, and then 7.5 above the RLE. So, somewhere about getting close to a quarter, a little bit less. And so they have a total budget of about 45 million. So 7.5 million above the required local effort.
So I wanted to because I know I had a side conversation with Dr. Wilson before this started, but in going back to what Ms. Holton said, I kind of viewed the local contribution based off of this new money that they may have to reallocate existing funds, but my takeaway wasn't new money coming forward to, am I correct in that? Or, like, I'm just, this is the big picture when you say it, like, across all states, not just one jurisdiction, across, a new consolidated at-risk and new would be, close to 132 million. Local contribution is almost 80 million. I thought that would just be a reallocation of money, not at.
So I think it would depend on the division. Some divisions may be fully locally funding current positions, and so they may be able to use state funds to kind of split that position, but some may have to put in new funds. It just depends on where they are in a funding above and beyond the SOQ.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Duran,
May I add a statement?
please.
I believe we need to keep that as 70% for flexible funds because the school divisions that need this flexible amount of spending, these children not only need the more experienced teachers, but they need more services as well. They have trauma in their life, so they will need more mental health supports. They will need more supports with the registered nurses, the school nurses, the counselors, therapeutic day treatments, things of that nature that local divisions that are struggling, they are supplying. So for instance, if you are a school division that has, that qualifies for 1.5 guidance counselors, and whereas another school in the division is very small and doesn't have the 1 to 500 ratio. I could be wrong on that number. So what they do is they take local funds. No school can function without a counselor. And so these positions are coming out of local money. So the flexibility is very important to divisions to be able to provide those services for these at-risk children.
Dr. Duran?
Something you said a minute ago remind me of a question I asked before. So the estimated annual cost is 131.9 million. Do we have any sense of what the local match would be above and beyond that in terms of a dollar amount? And that kind of goes back to some of the question that my colleague, Ms. Atkinson, was asking.
The table on the second page after the table of contents,
If
we've
you go to
added a
page
column to
2.
address local contributions. And note that that we didn't phrase it. Yes.
Page 2, yeah.
Note that we didn't phrase this as local fiscal impact. We referred to it as local contribution because we don't know what folks are already paying, what the school divisions are already
That makes sense.
contributing that could be used to pay
So
for that.
some of it may be new dollars, some of it may already be funding that they're already putting into those positions above and beyond.
So that's the max of the local impact, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be additional dollars because they could potentially move what they already have in their budget, and then that would in effect do what Ms. Atkinson was saying is not providing the additional. They're just okay.
We ready to talk about class size reduction? All right, so class size reduction is currently a program that resides in the Appropriation Act. It's not in the SOQ. It's a $128 million program that provides funds for school divisions to reduce ratios in individual schools that have the greatest rates of free lunch eligibility. In order to receive those funds, school divisions are required to reduce class sizes and teacher-student ratios in high-poverty schools according to the schedule in front of you. I'll disclose, so initially, the equity fund, we proposed using the funds for K-3 class size reduction and integrating that into the equity fund proposal, which would have made it a over $400 million fund. But we were concerned that that we would see class sizes begin to creep upward in grades K through 3 if those funds commingled with the flexible purpose funds, the 70% that we've been talking about. So instead, we propose moving the currently optional K-3 class size reduction fund into the SOQ. This would actually have no fiscal impact because the program is already funded, and most school divisions already maximize the class size reduction funds. We found that in the last fiscal year, only about 4% of the class size reduction funds were not utilized. Some school divisions either left some of that money on the table by having a slightly larger class size, either due to human resource issues or just brick and mortar issues. They may have not had classroom space to reduce all of their class sizes. So we propose moving it into the SOQ, but also providing some additional flexibility within this program that would allow school divisions to use the class size reduction funds to provide compensation supplements for experienced teachers to teach standard class sizes within grades K through 3 in high poverty schools.
Yeah, Diane.
Just a quick question. In the way this is calculated, is it based on division-wide or is it done school by school?
It's a school level.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else?
So, Mr. President,
Yeah, please.
nothing specific to that. I think that's a great proposal, but some overall SOQ observations and questions, is now the time for that? Or I don't know if they're done with their
You're doing a cost summary, right?
summary.
I have a summary slide. So that's-
Go ahead.
Could you just
Right there.
elaborate, Zach, a little bit more on why you think if this, if the funding here was part of the equity fund, the class size would start creeping up? How did you come to that conclusion?
So the K-3 class size reduction program has very specific parameters as far as what the class sizes required are, the maximum ratios. If we had moved those funds into the overall equity fund, it would have produced the additional positions, but we wouldn't have had a mechanism to require school divisions to have those reduced class size ratios.
Even though they had the federal guidelines to leverage those, even though you're combining it into a fund, I just didn't think that would take those triggers away, or whatever the technical term is for that. That's what I was
Yeah.
just curious.
So couple things. This is state program only, so it has no impact on federal title dollars or anything like that. It just tends to be those schools that get the better benefit from it. But what we felt like is if you gave school divisions the K-3 class size reduction money and opened up that they could be flexible to 70% of it, there's the likelihood that we could backtrack on all the work that we've done to keep those class sizes low. And so ultimately, in our debate as a team, you may remember from past months, I was very interested in this being a K-8 and really driving ratios down across. We somewhat conceded on that point from a financial standpoint and just wanted to start the conversation of class size being a standard of quality in terms of matching it with poverty. But if you put it in that other fund and open up the flexibility, I do believe that divisions will, in some divisions in some schools, will move up class sizes to make it happen. And what I didn't want anyone to perceive is that we were backtracking on work that was so positively funded by our General Assembly in the past.
So I have several general questions. One is back to a point that Ms. Atkinson made on effective versus experienced, kind of throughout. Effective is really what we want to get at. We're using experienced as a proxy for now. And I just wonder, given that this is going into something that's a document that's not easy to change, whether we could give ourselves some flexibility by saying something like, well, changing it all to effective and then somewhere defining effective equals experienced for now, unless and until the board comes up with some better measure of effectiveness. So in other words, it would continue to have the same impact. We would do experience, but when we change our performance evaluation system and get to the point of having a better measure of effectiveness, it would automatically switch to that?
So
Is there anything like that worth thinking about?
I thought about that. This was very intentional here, and I'll tell you why. And I can go back to the other example if you'd like me to. But even when we get to the point that we agree on an evaluation system, which will be, as Mr. Gecker now allowed 36 months, in 36 months. No, I'm kidding.
We may both be done in 36.
No, Kathy knows that this is important to us. But but even when that happens, 90% plus of teachers are generally going to be viewed as effective in that system.
Okay.
So we didn't
Gotcha.
want here
Okay.
for this to be allowable for 90% of teachers. We
Okay.
wanted it to drive experience specifically here so that it was a narrow set of folks that could experience
Okay.
this flexibility to move away.
Well, it might
from
be what
class
we
size.
really want is effective and experience, but I hear you that means, okay. It's highly, extremely effective. Okay. Okay. Moving on. One little one and then one big one. And the little one is just, communicating the impact. Those examples that you all have on page 6, I think are very helpful. I think the more of those we can do, even rounding out more division examples and more impact spelling it out. So for instance, the targeted compensation adjustment, what I was asking you to do with Petersburg, I mean, obviously it depends on an awful lot of factors, but in a hypothetical way, say, if a division chose to put all of their money into raises, they might be able to do XYZ with so many teachers or something. I just think the more you can make it real, the more people understand what we're doing.
Yeah, actually, I started out with even more than this. I was thinking of looking at the number of positions they already have on the ground and how things could.
I know it would be complicated, but I do think that the more concrete we can make this, the better. So now my bigger one is, can you respond to some of the highlights of some of the feedback we've gotten on this draft from, the VEA today, and we had public comment submitted by, I think, the Legal Aid Justice Center and the Virginia Education, what's the VEPC acronym?
Sure.
The coalition group. So are there any highlights of those, the particular comments submitted by those groups, or any of the other, I don't know if we've had anything from the separate members of the coalition,
yeah.
but what are the things they'd like us to do differently, and why are we not doing those?
Sure. We haven't had much feedback on this specific draft that you have right in front of you now because it was just posted last week.
So the letters we got were in
hear
response
more
to the last.
tomorrow from the team. I know several of them are signed up to speak during public comment. Just generally, some of the highlights we heard on previous drafts was the need for flexibility to not take that away from school divisions about some of their current programs. We also heard about the need to move to a weighted student funding formula. I think that is a more long-term vision that we heard from the Commonwealth Institute and a couple of other groups that they're interested in that. But I would say kind of the biggest one was flexibility and not taking away what school divisions currently have was the biggest kind of theme throughout. And then we did hear from VPEC, or at least some of the members of VPEC, about their concern on equitably distributing teachers. That's something we've heard for several months from them, that they're very concerned about that. I'm trying to think.
That they're, can you flesh out more the nature of the concern?
That potentially forcing teachers to move to different schools could be a challenge and that they may not be able to do that even with compensation adjustments. And that just placing teachers in general is always something that they struggle with. Hopefully I've.
But I think I think they should know that nothing we're doing is forcing anybody to go where they don't want to go. I mean, there are certainly systems that do that, but we don't. But in financially incentivizing it with potentially big incentives is the tool we're hoping to give some divisions. So
A couple months ago, we added in to the maximum extent possible, that language in. And so we felt like that provided them a
I
little
see
bit more.
that language about the ineffective concentration
Yes.
languages would be where we're not forcing anybody to force an individual teacher to go somewhere. We are requiring of school divisions not to have a concentration of their less effective teachers in. Okay.
And then I've done a little engagement as well with some of the associations. I did a phone call with every superintendent in the state about a week and a half ago. Broadly, very supportive of the board's movement. The other thing I'd say is they always prefer more flexibility to less flexibility. And I think that'd be important for me to say. And then the only other comment that I've read that really is a theme is there are a couple groups talking about their interest in the board looking at a per student with multiplier model versus a per position model. Commonwealth Institute was one of those. And I think that there's merit to studying that over the next 2 years, but I don't know that that is something that we could be prepared for in this cycle.
And were there also some more technical changes that we have either already incorporated or should be still considering, or am I wrong about? I did not print them out, so I'd have to go back and look. But
We
No.
can go back and look at
Okay.
those.
Francisco.
As a follow-up to Ms. Holton, any comment on the feedback we received today around the teacher leader mentor changes around the 3-year, third-year teacher, 4 more years experience? With the research does speak to the first, second, and third year of teachers being the ones needing a lot of support. So any feedback or comment on the conversation about that?
The reason we have not included third year is because we don't have data on it. So we only have 2 years of data so that that we've started capturing as it relates to new teachers. So we don't know who a third year teacher is.
So we wouldn't be able to assign a fiscal impact to it either.
So I think even in our research, we know that the first 3 years of mentorship and induction is important, but we just don't have the data in our collection right now to be able to assign that.
So that's very helpful that we don't have the data. I'm still concerned and wonder about the fact that we not include it, though I understand the fiscal impact. But I do have pause with that when I consider and having read a lot of research on third-year teachers, that one is concerning to me that we would not include that. Again, I understand why, and so thank you. That actually was very helpful, why it wasn't there. But just to my colleagues, I do think we should talk about that and consider that. I am concerned about thinking about teacher leaders and mentors and not having that very crucial third year being a part of that.
And just for background, I don't want to put any words into Emily's mouth too, but when we were going through this process in the equity committee, everything was evidence-based. It wasn't even, that was part of the discussion at the table of bringing evidence, but you're in this field, so you have evidence, so you can bring a whole nother, but that was part of it too, in trying to make some really good anecdotal decisions with the evidence to back it up.
But I think if I understood you correct, it's the evidence that we don't have to calculate the fiscal impact, not necessarily the evidence that doesn't show that having the third year would be really powerful and necessary. So, I mean, those are two very important distinctions, but if the research is really clear across the board, you can look at any reputable study that's been done, the third year, including that as beginning teacher leaders and support. But I do agree and understand the notion of lacking the evidence for the fiscal impact is a challenge. So I'm just toying with how do we address that?
May I?
Yeah, please.
So to that point, knowing that we don't have the data currently, are we making progress toward having access to such data so that we will be in a position then to
Yes, I think
consider?
it's, I think it's an issue where we hadn't, the data collection began 2 years ago. So in a year from now, we will have 3 years.
Okay, so knowing that a year hence, we would have that information, then is there any room, flexibility to consider the idea that's been voiced today in terms of the next iteration of the draft?
Yeah, so I think what we can do is we can add language about the third year and indicate that the current fiscal impact estimate is based upon the first 2 years, and try to come up with a ballpark for what we think it would look like at 3 years.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, when is that data collected?
Call the bullpen.
So,
Not sure.
End of third quarter?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's, I'm not sure
Sorry.
which
We can
collection
get back
comes in
to you on
third.
Yeah, we can come back. And with the notion that that project is 106 million now, I'll speak pragmatism, though the board can, I know you're setting markers. Just understand that as we have that better data for you next year, that'll set you up really well 2 years from now to come back and say, we needed that.
One more technical one from Ms. Bircher. She's with the VEA recommending that we keep the qualifying school definition from an earlier version of the proposal. I'm not sure I understand.
So I think what this is saying is that for every qualifying school, which we have in previous parts of the SOQ, they would also get an additional position.
Or maybe at least one. But in other words, is the term qualifying school no longer part of our proposal? Has that?
The phrase qualifying school was on the targeted compensation adjustment. A qualifying school was any school with, I think, 55% or more free lunch students.
But there's not a qualifying school term in the teacher, leader, mentor language as it
Correct.
currently
Because
constituted.
we're providing teacher leaders and mentors to all schools, not just qualifying schools.
Okay, so maybe that, but let me just say the general point, I appreciate you all working with the organized groups we've heard from, because we're just making big enough changes that if you're looking at even some of their technical suggestions, they may be catching things we're missing. So if you all can follow up with the VA about that one, among others, I'd be grateful. And if changes are needed, let us know.
We will. Thank you.
Anybody else? No? Okay. this
So
on the-
I can answer some questions that we got in feedback if that's necessary. I'm not sure if anyone has more questions on existing proposals, and if not, we'll move forward.
Move forward. All right, that concludes you guys for this.
Thank you.
Where we're looking to go, I guess this is on the agenda again tomorrow. I expect not quite the same level of discussion tomorrow. I don't mean from you, I'm talking about from us. You guys can do what you want to do. The, goal still is to move this through for the October meeting and to get to a point where we're comfortable. Now, obviously, if we're not comfortable, we won't do it in October. And then the secondary question we're going to have to answer is, are we going to actually issue SOQs, in the constitutional manner, or are we going to do this as recommendations? And maybe tomorrow at the board meeting, we can have some discussion about the merits of each of those paths and see where we're going, unless anybody wants to tackle it this afternoon. No? Okay. In that case, I guess. Huh? We do have time. I appreciate both of your work on this. This is a lot of stuff going on. I think important things. And, we're very grateful to have had, the quality of work product that we've seen here. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, anybody else? If not, I guess, I think that adjourns us, right? That concludes this one, and we come back in, what, 10 minutes for a work session? Well, I thought it was 3:15 or 10 minutes. Oh, it's the later of. You guys are killing me. All right, 3:15 for the, see, if I were really controlling the world, we'd be doing it now, but obviously.
It does in
It does in the advertisements. They trick us when they give us the agendas. Yeah. Okay.
We talked about this. We
We
said
did.
2 hours.
Yeah, we're good. We'll see you at 3:15. Thank you. Completely mine.